ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer. What do you do when the thing that made you great starts to kill you? Not a rival, not bad luck, not the economy, not a recession, not some external force you couldn't see coming. What do you do when the exact quality that built everything you are, the audacity, the obsession, the refusal to accept limits, quietly becomes the mechanism of your own destruction? Because that's what happened here. This is the story of the most famous company Britain ever produced. A company that built the engine that won World War II. And then, 30 years later, quietly, almost without warning, went completely bankrupt. Same people, same buildings, same name on the door. Different outcome. Manchester, May 4th, 1904. Two men walk into a hotel. They've never met. They know almost nothing about each other except what was passed along through a mutual acquaintance. A man named Henry Edmonds who had a feeling. One of those quiet feelings you can't quite explain. That these two particular people needed to be in the same room. One of the men is dressed well. Too well for a Tuesday afternoon. You might say his name is Charles Rolls III, son of a Baron Eton-educated, Cambridge-trained. The kind of man who was never going to have to worry about anything, and somehow managed to worry about everything anyway. Because men like that always find something to chase. He was obsessed with speed, with machines, with the new century's great toy, the automobile. The other man walks in like someone who has been walking fast his whole life and still hasn't arrived anywhere he intended. His name is Henry Royce. He sold newspapers on street corners when he was 9 years old. His father died and left nothing behind except debt and a lesson that the world does not slow down for grief. He had 1 year of formal education. One, not 1 degree. 1 year of school, total, before the world decided his time was better spent working than learning. He taught himself engineering from books, from watching, from taking things apart in the dark, because he couldn't afford to keep the lights on long enough to put them back together. And now here he is, in a hotel in Manchester, wearing the clothes of a man who has made something of himself. Because by 1904, he'd built a small electrical company, made a modest fortune, bought himself a French automobile, hated it. That automobile, that unreliable, poorly engineered, arrogant little machine, offended something deep in him. Not his pride, his standards. There's a difference. Pride is about you. Standards are about the thing itself. So he did what he always did when something wasn't right. He took it apart, rebuilt it, made it better. Then he built his own. And when Charles Rolls drove Henry Royce's car for the first time, he went quiet. That's the part of the story nobody tells. Not the handshake, not the agreement, not the famous names on the famous hood ornament. The silence. Because Charles Rolls had driven every significant automobile in the world at that point. He was one of the earliest racing drivers in Britain. He had opinions. He had taste. He had the aristocrat's absolute confidence that he knew what good felt like. And when he drove Royce's car, something in that confidence paused. Not collapsed, paused. Like a man who has been arguing for years that he knows exactly what the best version of something looks like, and then encounters it. Actually encounters it. And has to reckon with the fact that it wasn't what he'd imagined. It was better. The deal they made that afternoon was simple on the surface. Royce would build, Rolls would sell. Everything produced would carry both their names. Rolls' name came first, that was the world they lived in. The aristocrat's name before the craftsman's social gravity. But here's what that deal actually was underneath the surface. A man born with every advantage agreeing to lend his name, his connections, and his access to a man born with none of those things, because the man with none of those things had built something that the man with everything could not. That's not a business arrangement. That's a confession. There's a third man in this story, and most people skip him entirely. His name was Claude Johnson. He wasn't a founder, he wasn't an engineer, he wasn't an aristocrat or a self-made mechanic. He was something rarer than both. He understood what the thing meant. Johnson was the company's first commercial director, and he was, in many ways, the most important person in the room because Rolls and Royce created the product. But Johnson created the idea of the product. He gave the Silver Ghost its name. He wrote the phrase, "the best car in the world." He commissioned the Spirit of Ecstasy, that small silver woman with her arms outstretched leaning into the wind that you still see on every Rolls-Royce built today. He called himself the hyphen in Rolls-Royce. The connector, the invisible joint between two things that needed each other but couldn't quite reach. When Henry Royce's health collapsed in 1911, when the doctors said months, and Royce lived 20 more years out of sheer refusal, it was Johnson who arranged for him to work from a villa on the French Riviera, to direct the entire engineering operation of a major industrial company through letters, sketches, and telephone calls. Never returning to the factory, never walking the floor again, designing right up until the end, from the distance of a man who had learned that the world is best understood when you can't quite touch it. 3 men. One who was born into everything. One who was born into nothing. One who understood what the thing between them was worth. Together, they built something that outlasted all of them. And they also, without knowing it, built the exact conditions that would one day bring the whole thing down. There's a name you've probably never heard, and that's exactly the problem. Because this man, this one particular man, may have done more to determine the outcome of World War II than almost any general, any politician, any decision made in any war room on either side of the Atlantic. His name was Ernest Hives. He was born in Reading, England in 1886. His father was a clerk. Not poor, not wealthy. The kind of family where ambition was permitted, but resources were not. He had no engineering degree, no aristocratic connections, no inheritance waiting. What he had was this: an ability to look at a broken system and immediately understand not just what was wrong, but what it would take, specifically, to make it right. He joined Rolls-Royce in 1908 as a test driver. Not an engineer, not a designer, a test driver. The man who would eventually save the company, and arguably save Britain, started his career sitting behind a wheel, pushing machines to their limits, and writing down exactly what happened when they broke, which it turns out is the best possible education for what was coming. By the mid-1930s, Hives had worked his way through nearly every level of the company, and he had developed a reputation for something unusual in the corporate world of his era, or any era, frankly. He said what he actually thought, not diplomatically, not carefully, not with the kind of managed honesty that sounds like truth but functions like protection. He just said it. And something wasn't working. He said it wasn't working. When a decision was wrong, he said it was wrong. When the company was moving too slowly, which, in the years between the wars, it often was, he said so, loudly, and then proposed a specific alternative. This made some people uncomfortable. It made Rolls-Royce better. In 1936, Hives became General Works Manager. And the timing, in retrospect, was almost surgical. Because by 1936, anyone paying close attention to Europe could feel it. That low-frequency vibration that precedes catastrophe. The way the air changes before a storm, not dramatically, just differently. Something building. Something that hadn't announced itself yet, but was already inevitable. Germany was ramming quietly at first, then less quietly. The Luftwaffe was being rebuilt, not as a defensive force, but as a projection of will. And Britain, for reasons that mix politics and psychology and exhaustion from the last war, was moving slowly. Hives was not moving slowly. He understood something that governments often take too long to understand. That the gap between where you are and where you need to be cannot be closed quickly. Once the crisis arrives, you close it before, or you don't close it at all. So he pushed. He pushed the development of the Merlin engine, the 12-cylinder supercharged liquid-cooled machine that would become the most consequential aircraft engine in the history of powered flight. He pushed the expansion of the factories. He pushed the government to give him contracts before the contracts were politically comfortable to give. And when the war came, when it arrived not as a distant abstraction, but as bombs over London, as Spitfires climbing into September skies, as pilots in their early 20s going up, and sometimes not coming back. The infrastructure Hives had built was already there. Ready.
Here's what the Merlin actually was. Not technically. The numbers are impressive. But numbers don't tell you what a thing means. What it was, in the way that matters, was the physical embodiment of Henry Royce's last philosophy. Royce died in 1933. But before he died, on the beach at West Wittering, walking with a cane in the Sussex wind, he sketched the concept of what would become the Merlin, an engine that didn't exist, that no one had proven could exist in the form he was imagining. He sketched it anyway. And the men he left behind, Hives chief among them, built it. The Merlin powered the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster bomber that flew through German anti-aircraft fire deep into the continent night after night. The Mosquito, that strange, beautiful wooden aircraft that flew so fast the Luftwaffe could barely catch it. And then, And this is the detail that should stop you for a moment. The Merlin powered the P-51 Mustang, an American aircraft. The airplane that changed the strategic balance of the air war in Europe wasn't made in Britain. It was made in California. But the engine that transformed it from a capable fighter into an unstoppable one, that came from Derby, England, from the factory that Ernest Hives had spent a decade preparing for exactly this moment. By the end of the war, approximately 8,000 Merlin engines had been produced across factories in Derby, Crewe, Glasgow, Manchester, and Detroit. The Packard Motor Car Company, the American luxury automobile manufacturer, built 55 5233 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, more than any single British factory. Let that sit for a second. The engine that saved England was, in significant part, built in America by a car company in the same city that would decades later become the symbol of American industrial collapse. History has a sense of proportion that we rarely appreciate in the moment. After the war, Hives was made a lord. Baron Hives of Duffield, a hereditary peerage. The kind of honor that in Britain carries the weight of centuries of tradition. Given to a man whose father was a clerk, who started as a test driver, who never held a formal engineering degree. The citation could have been written simply: he built the machine that kept the lights on. But here's the thing about Ernest Hives that matters most for what comes next. He built more than an engine. He built a culture. A culture that said, the technically impossible is just the not yet attempted. A culture that said, if you believe something can be done, build it first and prove it after. A culture that said, our legacy is not what we've made. It's the standard we refuse to lower. That culture saved Britain in 1940. And that exact same culture, that precise, uncompromising, build what doesn't exist yet mentality, would walk Rolls-Royce directly off the edge of a cliff 30 years later. Not because it was wrong, because it was applied to a problem that didn't have the decency to wait until the solution was ready. There's a specific kind of danger that nobody warns you about. Not the danger that comes from weakness. The danger that comes from having been right too many times. Because when you've been right too many times, when your track record is long enough and clean enough and impressive enough, something subtle starts to happen inside an organization. Inside a person too, but especially inside an organization. The process of questioning starts to feel unnecessary. Not because people stop being intelligent, not because they stop caring, but because the evidence keeps confirming what they already believe. Every success builds a slightly thicker wall between the company and the possibility that this time, the calculation might be wrong. Rolls-Royce by the 1960s had been right for a very long time. They had built the engine that won the Battle of Britain. They had built the engines that powered the Lancaster bombers across Nazi Germany. They had survived a war, rebuilt a peacetime business, and established themselves as one of the most sophisticated aero-engine manufacturers on the planet. The lesson seemed obvious. We build what others cannot. We attempt what others won't. And we deliver
every single time. The jet age changed everything. After the war, commercial aviation exploded. The world wanted to move faster, farther, cheaper. The airlines wanted engines that were quieter, more fuel efficient, capable of carrying more people across wider oceans without stopping. And the engineers, good engineers, brilliant engineers, the kind of people who had grown up inside a culture built by Royce and hives, looked at what was being asked of them and thought, we can do this. More than that, we should do this. Because if we don't push the boundary here, someone else will. And that's not who we are. That instinct, that forward-leaning, refuse the limit instinct, had served them perfectly for 60 years. And then June 1967 arrived. The contract was called the WWII. The company it was with was Lockheed, the American aerospace manufacturer based in Burbank, California, building a new wide-body aircraft called the L-11 TriStar. The number attached to the contract, $350 million, the largest single commercial contract in British industrial history. The stakes were not small. This wasn't a development project. This was a declaration Rolls-Royce was announcing to the world, to Boeing, to General Electric, to Pratt & Whitney, that it intended to compete at the highest level of commercial aviation, that it would not be a specialty manufacturer of prestige products, that it was going to the center of the arena. The WWII was going to be the engine that got them there, and it was genuinely extraordinary. 3 shafts instead of 2. A design of almost shocking elegance and mechanical ambition. Bypass ratios that would deliver fuel efficiency decades ahead of conventional thinking, noise levels that would make it the quietest engine in its class. On paper, it was exactly the kind of machine that Henry Royce would have looked at and felt, somewhere, the satisfaction of the thing being what it should be. But it had one specific feature that didn't come from Henry Royce's beach sketches. It came from a laboratory for materials science, from the emerging technology of carbon fiber composites. The fan blades, the large rotating blades at the front of the engine that moved the air, were going to be made from something called high-fill 8 carbon fiber material developed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, lighter than titanium. Theoretically stronger under stress, cheaper to produce at scale. And completely, catastrophically untested in real operational conditions. Here is the moment where the story turns. Not dramatically, not with a single decision made by a villain in a boardroom. That's not how these things happen. These things happen in the accumulated weight of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, that together produce something unreasonable. The engineers believed in high-fill. They had good reasons to believe in it. The laboratory data was promising. The theoretical models were sound. And this is the part that matters most. Believing in it was consistent with everything the company had always done, with everything Royce had said, with everything Hives had built. If it doesn't exist, create it. So they created it. They designed an engine around a material that had never been proven in an operational environment. They priced a contract based on cost projections that assumed that material would work. They signed on a delivery timeline that assumed the testing would confirm what the theory predicted. Then the birds arrived.
Bird ingestion testing. Every aircraft engine must pass it. The FAA requires it. It's the test that simulates what happens when a bird, a goose, a starling, a flock of anything, gets pulled into a running jet engine at low altitude during takeoff or landing. Real engines survive this. They're designed to titanium blades flex, absorb, keep turning. The high-fill carbon fiber blades didn't flex.
They shattered. Not bent, not damaged, shattered into fragments. The kind of failure that in a real aircraft at low altitude on approach to an airport means something that cannot be said gently. The material was abandoned. It had to be. No aviation authority on Earth would certify an engine with fan blades that behaved this way. The blades would have to be remade in titanium. And here is where the mathematics of disaster begin. Titanium blades weighed more. More weight meant the engine's performance projections needed revision, which meant the aircraft's performance projections needed revision, which meant Lockheed's commitments to its airline customers needed revision. Titanium blades cost more to produce. More cost meant the development budget projections were wrong. The original estimate for total RB211 development, £65 million by September 1970. Before the engine had entered production, the actual cost had reached £170 million, 2.5 times the estimate. And the contract price, the price Lockheed was legally obligated to pay per engine, had been fixed in 1967. It could not be renegotiated upward to cover what had changed, which meant that every single engine Rolls-Royce delivered would be sold at a loss. Not a small loss, not a manageable loss, a structural, permanent, mathematically guaranteed loss that grew larger with every engine shipped and every month the program continued. The more successful the TriStar became, the faster Rolls-Royce would go bankrupt. Think about that for a moment. They had signed a contract where success was worse than failure, where every order filled was a step closer to insolvency, where the company's greatest commercial achievement, winning the largest contract in British industrial history, had become the mechanism of its own destruction. This is not a story about incompetence. The engineers were not incompetent. The executives were not reckless in the ordinary sense of the word. This is a story about what happens when the culture that produces greatness outlives the conditions that made that culture safe. Rolls-Royce had built a machine, not an engine, a machine, a way of thinking, a set of reflexes about what was possible and what was permitted, that had worked for 60 years. And in 1967, that machine walked them off a ledge, not with a push, with confidence.
February 4th, 1971. It's a Thursday. And somewhere in London, in an office that looks like every other office in every other British institution of that era. Dark wood, heavy curtains, the particular silence of a place where serious things happen quietly. A decision is being formalized that no one in that building wanted to be the one to formalize. Rolls-Royce Limited is entering receivership. The word receivership is a careful word, a legal word, a word designed to describe catastrophic financial failure in the flattest possible tone, as if the flatness of the language might soften the weight of what it means. It means bankrupt. The most famous engineering company in Britain, the company whose name was synonymous, globally, not just domestically, with the absolute pinnacle of what human craftsmanship could produce. The company whose engines had powered the aircraft that kept Britain free. Bankrupt. The newspapers the next morning carried the story on their front pages. And there's something worth pausing on here. Not the headlines themselves, but the tone of them. Because when a company goes bankrupt, there's usually a register of inevitability to the coverage. The signs were there. The warning was ignored. We should have seen this coming. The Rolls-Royce coverage didn't have that tone. It had the tone of something that wasn't supposed to be able to happen. Not surprise,
Exactly, more like the specific disorientation you feel when something you had categorized as permanent turns out not to be. When a fixed point moves. Britain had lost an empire in the decades before this, had navigated the aftermath of 2 world wars, had watched industry after industry contract, restructure, decline. But Rolls-Royce was supposed to be different. Rolls-Royce was supposed to be the thing that survived. Now, let's talk about the man in the room who understood, perhaps better than anyone, what this actually meant. Not a politician, not a banker, not a receiver appointed by the courts. A man named Frederick Caulfield. He was the Minister for Aerospace in Edward Heath's Conservative government. And he was the man who had to walk into a cabinet meeting and explain to a prime minister who had built his political identity on the principle of not rescuing failing companies, that they were going to rescue this one. Right now. Without a plan, without a precedent, without the kind of careful parliamentary process that normally precedes a nationalization of this scale. Because they had no choice. Here's what was actually at stake, and it's important to understand the full architecture of the crisis, because this wasn't just about one company. The Rolls-Royce Aero Engine division supplied engines to the Royal Air Force. If the company collapsed entirely, if the receivers sold off the assets to the highest bidder, if the engineering teams dispersed, if the manufacturing capability was lost, Britain's defense capacity would have a hole in it that couldn't be filled quickly. Not in months, in years, possibly in a decade. And on the other side of the Atlantic, Lockheed was not in good shape either. The TriStar program, the program that had been built around the RB2L1, was in crisis. Lockheed had taken orders from airlines, had made commitments, had spent money that was contingent on an engine that now had no manufacturer behind it. Lockheed employed 60,000 people in California alone. The ripple effects of a Lockheed collapse would move through the entire American aerospace supply chain, through hundreds of smaller manufacturers, subcontractors, suppliers, in states across the country. The bankruptcy of one British engine company was about to become a transatlantic economic crisis.
The Heath government moved fast. Within 72 hours of the receivership announcement, the decision had been made. The Aero Engine division of Rolls-Royce would be nationalized. The government would take it over, fund it, and continue operations. The car division, the Phantom, the Silver Shadow, the brand that sat on the driveways of the world's wealthy, was separated, left in receivership, eventually sold in 1980 to a British defense conglomerate called Vickers. But the engine business, the RB211, the defense contracts, the 60-plus years of accumulated aerospace knowledge, that would become a state-owned enterprise. And here is the exquisite political irony of this moment. Edward Heath had campaigned on the explicit promise that his government would not bail out failing businesses, that the market would be allowed to work, that the era of government propping up industries that couldn't survive on their own merits was over. He had, in fact, allowed a previous company, a shipbuilder called Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, to enter liquidation, specifically to demonstrate that he meant what he said. And now, 6 months later, he was nationalizing Rolls-Royce. Not because he changed his mind, because there are principles,
And there are consequences. And sometimes the consequences are large enough that the principles have to wait outside. There's a lesson in that moment that goes well beyond Rolls-Royce. Every system, political, corporate, personal, has a stated set of values. Things it says it believes, lines it says it won't cross. And then there are the actual values. The ones revealed not by what the system says in comfortable times, but by what it does when the cost of consistency becomes unbearable. Heath said, "We don't rescue failing companies." Heath did rescue Rolls-Royce. That's not hypocrisy exactly. That's just the difference between a principle and a limit. Every organization is both. The ones that survive long enough are usually the ones that know which is which. But here's the thing. The nationalization solved the immediate problem. It did not solve the underlying one. Because the underlying problem wasn't financial. The financial crisis was a symptom. The underlying problem was this. A company had built a culture so committed to doing what others said couldn't be done, so structurally resistant to the possibility of being wrong, that when the moment came, where the limitation was real, where the material actually didn't work, where the cost actually couldn't be contained, the culture didn't have a reflex for it. It didn't know how to stop. It didn't know how to say, "This one, we cannot do. Not yet. Not this way. Not at this price." That muscle had never been exercised. Because for 60 years it had never needed to be. Ernest Hives had died in 1965. 6 years before the collapse. And I've thought about this, about what he would have said, watching from wherever it is that men like Hives go when they're finished. He might have recognized it. The overreach, the refusal to qualify the ambition, the assumption that the past performance guaranteed the future result. He built that culture. He understood it better than anyone. And I think he would have been the first to say what no one in 1967 was willing to say clearly enough. This is the one we're not ready for. But he wasn't there. And the culture he built didn't know how to say it without him.
There's a version of this story that stays in England, that begins in Manchester, ends in London, and is filed neatly under the category of British industrial history. Interesting to some, relevant to fewer, and ultimately contained within the borders of a country working through the long, complicated process of figuring out what it was after empire. That version of the story is incomplete. Because what happened at Rolls-Royce in February of 1971 didn't stay in England. It crossed an ocean. And when it landed in a building in Burbank, California, in the offices of a company that had been, for the better part of 3 decades, one of the most strategically important manufacturers in the United States. Lockheed. You need to understand what Lockheed was in 1971. Not just as a company, as an institution. Lockheed had built the P-38 Lightning in World War II, one of the most effective American fighter aircraft of the conflict. It had built the U-2 spy plane, the aircraft that flew over the Soviet Union at altitudes Soviet missiles couldn't reach,
and whose 1960 shoot-down had nearly started a war. It had built the SR-71 Blackbird, still, to this day, the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever flown. This was not a struggling manufacturer with a questionable future. This was the company that had defined American aerospace capability for 30 years. And in 1971, it was in serious financial trouble. Not because of its defense work, not because of incompetence or mismanagement in any obvious sense, because it had bet its commercial aviation future on a wide-body aircraft, the L-11 TriStar, that had been designed around an engine that was now, suddenly, without a manufacturer. The numbers inside Lockheed in early 1971 were the kind of numbers that produce very quiet conference rooms. Lockheed had taken orders for the TriStar from major airlines, Eastern, TWA. Delta had made commitments that were legally binding and financially enormous, had spent development money that was contingent on the RB dual on being delivered on time, at the contracted price, by a manufacturer that had just gone bankrupt. None of those conditions now held. The renegotiation that followed the Rolls-Royce receivership was not a conversation between equals. It was a company in trouble trying to rewrite agreements with a newly nationalized British enterprise through intermediaries across an ocean, while airlines waited and competitors circled. And underneath all of it was the number that mattered most. Lockheed employed, at that point, approximately 60,000 people in California, directly, not counting the supply chain, not counting the subcontractors in other states, the smaller manufacturers whose order books depended on Lockheed contracts, the towns built around the work. If Lockheed collapsed, the unemployment numbers in California alone would shift in ways that no governor, no senator, no administration could ignore. And so the question arrived in Washington, quietly at first, then less quietly. Should the United States government guarantee an emergency loan, $250 million, to a private American corporation that had made, at least in part, decisions that contributed to its own crisis? The debate that followed was not comfortable, and it shouldn't have been, because it was a real debate, not a procedural one, not a formality dressed in parliamentary language. A genuine argument between people who disagreed about something fundamental, about the proper relationship between government and private enterprise, about who bears the cost of institutional failure, about whether certain companies are too strategically important to be allowed to fail. Sound familiar? It should, because this argument didn't end in 1971. It's the same argument that showed up in 2008 with the banks. The same argument that showed up in 2009 with General Motors. The same argument that surfaces every time a large, strategically significant institution reaches the edge of the cliff and turns to the people it spent years insisting it didn't need. The argument never gets easier. The stakes just change.
The case against the loan was made clearly. If Lockheed had made poor decisions, had overextended, had misjudged the risks of the TriStar program, had structured contracts in ways that left it exposed, then Lockheed should bear the consequences. That's how the market works. That's how capitalism functions. You cannot have a system where reward is private but risk is public, where companies keep the profits in the good years and pass the losses to taxpayers in the bad ones. The argument was not wrong. The people making it were not wrong. They were making a principled case with real intellectual foundations for a position that has genuine merit. But here's what the argument didn't account for.
It didn't account for the 400,000 workers, not 60,000, but 400,000, when you count the full supply chain, whose livelihoods were connected directly or indirectly to whether Lockheed survived. It didn't account for the defense implications, for the fact that Lockheed's military programs didn't disappear because its commercial division failed, that the institutional knowledge, the cleared personnel, the manufacturing capability, none of that could be rebuilt quickly if the company ceased to exist. And it didn't account for the defense implications, for the fact that Lockheed's military programs didn't disappear because its commercial division failed, that the institutional knowledge, the cleared personnel, the manufacturing capability, none of that could be rebuilt quickly if the company ceased to exist. And it didn't account for something harder to quantify but no less real: the signal it would send, not just domestically, internationally, to allies who were watching, to adversaries who were watching, to the markets, which are, in the end, as much about confidence as they are about numbers. The House of Representatives voted on July 30th, 1971, 1970 in favor of the loan guarantee, 18-9 against. 3 votes, 3 members of the United States House of Representatives out of 435 stood between Lockheed surviving and Lockheed collapsing, and everything downstream of that. 3 people. Think about what that means in terms of probability, in terms of how close it actually was, in terms of how many phone calls, how many last-minute conversations, how many quiet pressures applied in corridors by people whose names never appear in any account of this story, happened in the hours before that vote to move 3 people from one column to the other. History, at this resolution, looks less like destiny and more like improvisation. 3 days later, August 2nd, 1971, the United States Senate prepared to vote. And by the time the count reached its conclusion, by the time the clerks had their numbers and the chamber had its answer, the result was this: 49 senators voted yes, 48 senators voted no. A tied vote in the United States Senate defeats the measure, which means the decision, the entire weight of what came before and what would come after, now rested on a single person, the Vice President of the United States, whose name, whose particular name, and everything attached to it, is the last piece of this story that no one quite expects.
His name was Spyro Theodore Agnew. And if you know that name, if it means something to you beyond this story, then you already understand the particular weight that it carries here. Because Spyro Agnew is not remembered as a hero. He's not remembered as a statesman or a visionary or a man whose judgment history has vindicated with the slow, generous revision that sometimes redeems complicated figures. He's remembered primarily for what happened 2 years after this vote. On October 10th, 1973, Spyro Agnew became the 2nd vice president in American history to resign from office. He pleaded no contest to a charge of federal income tax evasion. He had been taking cash bribes from contractors, from engineers, from the kind of people who needed something from the government, and found that Agnew was the kind of man who could be persuaded to help. Going back to his time as a county executive in Maryland, the man who cast the deciding vote to save Rolls-Royce was, at the moment he cast it, already a man being investigated for corruption. He just didn't know that Washington knew yet. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not to make a point about the moral character of the person, not to suggest that the vote was wrong because of who cast it. Not to reach for some easy irony about the relationship between power and integrity. Just to notice what it means about how history actually works.
We construct these narratives, these clean, purposeful arcs where the right decisions are made by the right people for the right reasons and the outcomes flow logically from the choices. Because it's the only way the human mind can hold the scale of what happens. But underneath the narrative, at the level of the actual moment, this is what history looks like. A man under investigation for bribery, sitting in the chamber of the United States Senate, casting the deciding vote on whether a British company, nationalized by a conservative government that campaigned against nationalization, would survive because an American aerospace manufacturer had built a plane around an engine whose fan blades shattered when hit by a bird. That's it. That's the actual mechanism. Not destiny, not the inevitable arc of greatness asserting itself, not some invisible hand guiding the outcomes toward the version that the story deserves. Just a man, in a room with a vote. Agnew voted yes. And with that vote, with that single unremarkable procedural act in the middle of an August afternoon in Washington, the Emergency Loan Guarantee Act passed. $250 million, guaranteed by the United States government, flow into Lockheed Corporation, which meant Lockheed would survive, which meant the TriStar program would continue, which meant the renegotiated contract with the newly nationalized Rolls-Royce Aero Engine division had something on the other end of it, which meant the engineers in Derby, the ones who had built the Merlin, and the ones who would eventually resolve the WWII, and the ones who would go on to build the engines that power a significant portion of the world's commercial aviation fleet today, still had a company to work for. All of it. The entire chain, held together at its most fragile point by the vote of a man who 2 years later would resign in disgrace.
Now I want to tell you something about the WWII, because this is the part of the story that almost never gets told. The engine that caused the bankruptcy, the engine that broke the company, that triggered the nationalization, that nearly took Lockheed with it, did not disappear. It was finished. After the nationalization, with government funding and a renegotiated contract and the kind of engineering stubbornness that is both the company's greatest quality and its most dangerous one, the WWII was completed, certified, delivered. It entered service on the Lockheed TriStar in 1972. And it worked. Not just worked. It was, by many measures, exactly what it had promised to be: quiet, efficient, reliable. The three-shaft design that had seemed so audacious, so overreaching, so characteristic of a company that had confused its legacy with its invulnerability, turned out to be genuinely, measurably better than the alternatives. The WWII became the platform for an entire family of engines that Rolls-Royce still builds today. The Trent series, the engines that power the Boeing 787, the Airbus A380, the wide-body aircraft that carry hundreds of millions of passengers every year, traces its direct lineage to the engine that bankrupted the company. The thing that destroyed them became the foundation of everything that came after. And here is where the story asks its hardest question. Was it worth it? The bankruptcy, the nationalization, the 60,000 workers in California who spent months not knowing if their company would exist, the shareholders who lost everything when Rolls-Royce entered receivership, the politicians forced to abandon stated principles under pressure, the families of engineers who built a revolutionary engine and watched it take the company down before it could prove what it was. Was it worth it? I'm not going to answer that. Not because I don't have a view, but because the question itself is the point. Because every organization, every person, if we're being honest, at some point builds something that costs more than they budgeted.
runs longer than they planned, breaks in ways they didn't anticipate, and asks them to decide. Do you walk away and call it a loss, or do you stay and call it unfinished? The answer to that question is never obvious in the moment. It only becomes obvious later. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the thing you almost abandoned is the thing that defines everything you build afterward. There's one more detail I want to give you. Ernest Hives died in 1965, 6 years before the collapse. But Stanley Hooker was still alive. Hooker was a mathematician, a brilliant, unconventional thinker who had joined Rolls-Royce during the war and solved the supercharger problem on the Merlin that no one else had been able to crack. He'd left the company, gone to Bristol Aero Engines, built a separate career. And when the RB211 was in crisis, when the technical problems were accumulating faster than the solutions, Rolls-Royce brought Stanley Hooker back, out of retirement, to finish what the company had started. He was 62 years old. He came back because the problem wasn't solved yet. And for men like Hooker, like Royce, like Hives, an unsolved problem is not something you walk away from. You walk away when it's done, not before.
Before I continue, if you've stayed with me this far, through Manchester in 1904, through the Battle of Britain, through the carbon fiber blades that shattered, and the vote that held by one, I want to say something directly. This channel exists because there are stories like this one. Stories that don't make the highlight reel, that don't fit the 30-second version, that require you to sit down, slow down, and actually follow something from the beginning to the end to understand what it means. If that's the kind of content you want more of, subscribe, turn on the notification, because we put out videos like this regularly, and the algorithm will not always find you. You have to choose to come back. That's it, no pressure, just an invitation. Now, there's something I've been thinking about through this entire story, and it's this. Every person watching this has, at some point, built something they believed in completely and watched it break before it was finished. Maybe it was a business, maybe a relationship, maybe just a version of yourself you were certain you were becoming, before life recalibrated the timeline without asking your permission. And the question that the Rolls-Royce story keeps asking, quietly, underneath all the history and the engineering and the Senate votes, is not whether the thing broke. Everything breaks. The question is what you do in the room after the thing breaks. When the receivers are at the door, when the contract is underwater, when the fan blades have shattered and the timeline is gone and the cost has doubled and the people who believed in you were starting to look at you differently. Do you call it a failure and walk away? Or do you call it unfinished and stay? Stanley Hooker came back at 62 to finish an engine that had bankrupted the company he loved. He didn't come back because someone asked him to heroically sacrifice his retirement. He came back because the problem wasn't solved yet. And that distinction between obligation and compulsion, between duty and a particular pull of an unfinished thing, is the distinction that runs through every person in this story. Royce designing on his deathbed, Hives pushing the government for contracts before the war declared itself, Hooker returning to Derby with his notebooks and his refusal to accept that the thing was over. These men were not extraordinary because they were fearless. They were extraordinary because the unfinished thing bothered them more than the personal cost of finishing it. That's a specific kind of character. It's not common, and it cannot be manufactured by culture or incentive structure or any leadership framework ever written. It either lives in you or it doesn't.
The nationalized Rolls-Royce aero engine division was eventually privatized again. In 1987, it returned to public ownership, listed on the London Stock Exchange, independent, carrying with it the full weight of what had happened and the full capability of what had been built through it. Today, Rolls-Royce Holdings, the aero engine company, entirely separate from the car brand, generates revenues exceeding $16 billion annually. Its engines power a significant percentage of the world's long-haul commercial flights. Its defense division supplies engines to the Royal Air Force, the United States Navy, and armed forces across NATO. The company that went bankrupt in 1971 is, by every financial measure, larger and more consequential today than at any point in its history. And the RB2E1, the engine that caused everything, is the direct ancestor of the Trent engine family that makes all of that possible. The thing that broke them became the foundation, not despite the collapse. Because of it, the car company followed a different path. Vickers. Then the extraordinary corporate battle of 1998, when Volkswagen paid $413 million for the factory and BMW paid $14 million for the name. And the one who paid less walked away with the thing that mattered more. Today, Rolls-Royce Motor Cars operates from a factory in Goodwood, West Sussex, Green Roof 2, 500 craftspeople from 50 countries, 6,000 cars per year. Average transaction price, €500,000. Record sales in 2024. Record sales in 2023. Record sales in 2023. The youngest average customer age of any luxury automobile brand in the BMW Group. The Spirit of Ecstasy, commissioned by Claude Johnson in 1911. The small silver figure leaning into the wind, still on every car, still there, after everything. There is a version of this story where February 4th, 1971 is the end. Where the receivers come, the assets are sold, the name disappears into some holding company's portfolio, and Rolls-Royce becomes a footnote. A cautionary tale about British industrial hubris, about companies that confused their past with their future, about the gap between what a thing was and what it believed itself to be. That version didn't happen. Not because the universe intervened. Not because greatness asserted itself. Because specific people, in Derby, in Washington, in Burbank, in the retirement of a 62-year-old mathematician who couldn't leave an unsolved problem alone, made specific decisions, in sequence, under pressure, without certainty. And those decisions, accumulated, produced a different outcome. That's the mechanism. Not destiny. Not legacy protecting itself. People, decisions, sequence. Hemi Royce was 9 years old when he started working. Not because he wanted to. Not because work was a virtue someone had explained to him in a way that made sense. But because the alternative was something worse, and he was old enough to understand the difference between the two. He sold newspapers. He delivered telegrams. He moved through a world that had already decided, before he had any say in the matter, exactly how much he was worth and exactly where the ceiling was. And then he spent the rest of his life proving that the ceiling was in the wrong place. Not loudly. Not with the kind of performance that announces itself quietly through the work. Through the specific, relentless, unglamorous act of making things better than he found them. One component at a time. Until the accumulated difference between what existed before him and what existed after him was impossible to ignore. He never ran a country, never commanded an army,
never appeared on the front page for anything other than the things he made. He just built. And I've been thinking, throughout this entire story, about what it actually means to build something. Not to start something, not to announce something, not to vision board or strategize or position or brand. To actually build. Because building, real building, the kind that lasts, is almost entirely unglamorous. It's the 10,000th hour of work on a problem that hasn't resolved yet. It's the decision to go back into the room the morning after the thing broke and try again. Not because you're certain it'll work, but because leaving it unfinished is worse than the uncertainty of continuing. It's Royce sketching on the beach in the Sussex wind because his body was failing, but the problem wasn't solved. It's Hives in 1936, pushing for contracts no one wanted to give him yet, because he could feel something building in Europe that most people were still hoping wasn't real. It's Hooker at 62, unpacking his notebooks in Derby, not because he owed anyone anything, but because the work called him back. There's a question that this story keeps circling without ever quite landing on directly. And I want to name it now. Not answer it, just name it. The question is, what is the relationship between the thing that makes you great and the thing that eventually breaks you? Because in every case in this story, Royce's obsessive standards, Hives' industrial audacity, the company's refusal to accept the limits of what was currently possible, the attribute that produced the extraordinary result and the attribute that produced the catastrophic failure, are not two different things. They are the same thing, applied in different conditions, at the wrong moment with insufficient information, in the absence of the person who might have said, "Not this time, not yet, not at this price." That's not a story about weakness. That's a story about the specific cost of genuine strength, the kind that produces Merlin engines and wins wars and builds companies that outlast their founders. It does not come with an internal governor. It does not know how to be moderate. It does not check itself against worst-case scenarios before it commits. It commits completely. That's why it works. And that's precisely why, when the conditions change, it can walk you off a ledge, while you're still absolutely certain you're moving forward.
I want to tell you about February 4th, 1971, one more time. Not the bankruptcy, not the receivership, not the headlines, the engineers. The men who came to work that morning in Derby, who had spent years, in some cases decades, on the RB21, who had poured something real and irretrievable into that engine, who had not, most of them, been the ones to sign the original contract or set the cost projections or make the strategic decisions that produced the crisis, who had just been doing what the company had always done, building what didn't exist yet, trying to make the thing be what it was supposed to be. They came to work that morning, and the company they worked for was bankrupt, and most of them came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Because the engine wasn't finished. The RB21 entered service in 1972. Delivered certified working, quiet, efficient, and, as it turned out, the beginning of an engine lineage that would go on to power some of the most significant commercial aircraft ever built. The engineers who built it did not receive the kind of recognition that gets written into history books. Their names do not appear in most accounts of this story. The people who are remembered are the politicians who nationalized the company, the vice president who cast the vote, the executives who signed the contract. The engineers are the background. They always are. But the thing they made is still flying.
right now today, somewhere above the Atlantic or the Pacific or the flat middle of a continent at 35,000 feet, there is an aircraft being held in the air by an engine whose DNA traces directly back to Derby, 1967, to the moment a company bet everything on a material that didn't work yet and refused to stop until it did. That's not nothing. There's a version of ambition that is really just fear wearing different clothes. The fear of being ordinary, the fear of the ceiling, the fear that the thing you were born into is the thing you'll die inside of, unless you push hard enough and long enough and relentlessly enough to get somewhere else. Henry Royce knew that version. He started there. But somewhere along the way, in the factory, at the workbench, in the villa on the Riviera where he directed an engineering company from a distance because his body couldn't take the cold anymore, something shifted. The ambition stopped being about fear. It became about the work itself, about the difference between a thing that is good and a thing that is what it should be, about the specific satisfaction, quiet, private, not requiring an audience, of making something better than you found it. That shift. That's the whole story. Not the bankruptcy, not the Senate vote, not the records broken in 2023 and the average transaction price in the green roof in West Sussex. The shift from ambition as escape to work as its own reason. Ernest Hives built a culture, Henry Royce built a standard, Claude Johnson built a myth. Charles Rolls gave the thing a name and died before he could see what it became. Stanley Hooker came back at 62 to finish what someone else had started. And Spiro Agnew, corrupt, under investigation, 2 years from disgrace, sat in a Senate chamber in August and voted yes. None of them knew they were part of the same story. They were just doing the next thing in front of them. That's all any of us ever do.
There's a factory in West Sussex, England. It sits on 42 acres of land leased from an English earl on a 125-year agreement. The roof is covered in wildflowers, 3.5 hectares of sedum and native plants, the largest living roof in the United Kingdom. From the air, it looks less like a factory and more like a field that happens to have walls. Inside, 2,500 people from 50 countries come to work every day. They build approximately 6,000 cars per year. Each one takes around 450 hours to make. There is one man, one specific man, whose job it is to paint a thin line along the body of every Rolls-Royce that leaves Goodwood by hand. With a brush, a line so precise and so particular that the company has stated officially that it will never be done by machine. When he retires, someone new will be trained, but it will be a different line, because it will be a different hand. I've been thinking about that line, about what it means that in a world of automation and artificial intelligence and manufacturing processes optimized to the 16th decimal place, a company that sells $500,000 cars still has one man painting a line by hand, because no machine does it right. Not because machines aren't precise enough, because precision isn't the point. The point is the hand. The point is the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable human presence in the thing. The knowledge that somewhere in the object you own, there is a mark that could only have been made by a particular person on a particular day, with a particular quality of attention that no algorithm will ever fully replicate. Henry Royce understood this, not as a marketing concept, as a fact of what things are. A thing made with full attention is different from a thing made without it. Even if you can't measure the difference with instruments,
You can feel it. The last time I want to go back to February 4th, 1971. Not to the bankruptcy, not to the politics, not to the mechanics of the receivership or the nationalization of the vote. To a specific moment that I imagine, because no one recorded it. But that, I believe, happened somewhere in Derby, late in the afternoon of February 4th, 1971. An engineer, unnamed, unremarkable in every historical sense, walked out of the factory building where he had spent years working on an engine that had just bankrupted the company. He didn't know yet whether the company would survive. He didn't know about the nationalization that would be announced within 72 hours. He didn't know about the vote in Washington 6 months away. He didn't know that the engine he had spent years on would eventually be completed, certified, delivered, and become the direct ancestor of a technology still flying today. He just knew that the engine wasn't finished, and he walked home, and he came back the next morning. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not the Senate vote, not the spirit of ecstasy, not the record sales and the living roof and the craftspeople from 50 nations. A man who came back the next morning because the work wasn't done. That is the story of Rolls-Royce. That is the story of everything that has ever survived its own collapse. Not glory, not destiny, not the inevitable arc of greatness asserting itself against the odds. Just people choosing, one morning at a time, to continue.
I want to ask you something before we finish. And I want you to actually think about it. Not perform thinking about it. Not file it away for later consideration. But actually sit with it for the 30 seconds it deserves. What is the unfinished thing in your life right now? Not the abandoned thing. Not the thing you've made peace with leaving incomplete, but the thing that still bothers you. The thing that comes back at inconvenient times, the problem you haven't solved, the work you haven't returned to. The thing that, if you're honest, is calling you back. I'm not telling you to go back to it. I'm just asking you to notice that it's there. Because Royce noticed, and Hooker noticed, and the unnamed engineer in Derby noticed. And the noticing, the simple, honest act of acknowledging that the thing isn't done, is where everything else begins. There's a question I want to leave you with. It's not a rhetorical question. It's not a setup for an answer I'm about to give you. It's just the question that this story left me with, and that I think it's worth carrying. The Merlin engine saved the free world. The culture that built the Merlin engine destroyed the company that built it. The engine that destroyed the company became the foundation of the company's greatest period of success. And the vote that made all of it possible was cast by a man who, 2 years later, resigned in disgrace. So here it is. If you knew in advance that the thing you were building would cost more than you could afford, would break before it worked, would bankrupt everything you'd spent your life creating, but that it would also, eventually, if you or someone else stayed with it long enough, change everything, would you build it? If this story stayed with you, share it with 5 people who would sit with it the way you did. Not to grow a channel, not for the numbers. Because stories like this one don't find their way to people who need them through algorithms. They find their way through the specific, intentional act of one person saying to another, I think you should hear this. Leave a comment below. Not a reaction, a thought. Something this story left you with. Something it unsettled. Something it confirmed. And if there's a company, a person, a moment in history that you think deserves this kind of telling, leave that too. We'll be back.